Welcome to Mrs. True Crime. Today's video is an in-depth look into the sensationalized murder of Evelyn Renee Wagler. It's a tale of conspiracy and fear. If you're triggered by anything dealing with fire or death, feel free to click off this video. Perhaps check out a deer video for some lighthearted content. If not, I'm Nicole. Let's get started. In late September 1973, in Boston, Massachusetts, 800 black and white teens in Dorchester High School attacked each other with pipes, rocks, and hockey sticks. On October 4th, 1973, white 65-year-old Ludovicio Luis Barba was violently stabbed at Columbia Point during his fishing excursion. Police believe that he was fatally stabbed in the chest and back with his own fishing knife during a robbery. Two black youths, aged 15 and 16, were charged with murder, but the media had a field day before they were apprehended. As it goes, the media, and it appears the police, alleged that Barba was stoned to death by 40 or so black teenagers. Though the coroner reported that Barba, quote, also had cuts on his head consistent with blows from rocks, end quote, and according to eyewitnesses, a, quote, gang of black youths were seen throwing rocks near Barba shortly before his death, unquote, it wasn't conclusive with the autopsy. Reporter Jeff Leonard of the Harvard Crimson noted that, quote, the Boston Globe, the Herald American, the New York Times, the New York Daily News, and other national newspapers all relied on sketchy police reports that black youths had thrown rocks at Barba and reported his death thusly, unquote. Even after the truth of the crime was revealed, reporters continued to poke at interracial conflicts. The strongest force was the murder of Evelyn Wagler. Evelyn Wagler was a 24-year-old German-born Swiss separated from husband Mark Wagler, who lived in Chicago with their 6-year-old son. Evelyn was a, quote, short, fresh-faced, energetic woman with dipped brown hair and traces of a German accent, unquote. She was a radical feminist who lived in communes with women liberationists on the south side of Chicago. Prior to moving to Boston, she'd worked in Pennsylvania for 3 months as a house painter and carpenter on a farm. Along with her radical views, she also changed her name to Renee, using it for documents and ID purposes. Though an article stated she hitchhiked, another informs that she provided her own transportation with a 1966 Rambler station wagon to the predominantly black neighborhood of Blue Hill Avenue, taking shelter with her fellow liberationists. Karen, Kathy, Veronica, Demita, and Nikki. 3 were black, 2 were white. Renee wasn't bothered by her neighbors. She'd grown accustomed to diversity living in Chicago. The threat, quote, "Whitey, get out of this part of town," unquote, thrown to her by 3 black teens rolled off her back as, quote, street jive, unquote. Renee Wagler wouldn't be threatened. According to the New York Times, on October 2, 1973, after job hunting, Renee and Veronica were going to pick up Kathy but got lost. The car ran out of gas at the corner of Elm Hill and Seaver. The two walked home to 15 Wayne Street, where Renee fixed the back door, then grabbed a red gas can and left. The nearest gas station was closed, so she opted to walk 11 blocks to another gas station alone. It was around 9:30 p.m. at the latest, and most of the shops she passed were closed or empty. Riots from the 1968 death of Martin Luther King Jr. left the structures boarded up with, quote, now tattered and faded Black Power posters smeared with crude slogans, unquote. Renee successfully purchased her gas and was heading back to her car. The atmosphere is described as quiet, with few, if any, pedestrians walking around her. Street lights illuminated the block, but the air becomes tense. She closes in on 505 Blue Hill Avenue, and this is where her nightmare begins. Out of the darkness, 6 black youths emerge shouting racial slurs. They begin to circle her, shoving and beating her until she's forced down an alley between a house and a yellow abandoned apartment building. From here, she stands behind the apartment building in its rundown vacant lot and is ordered by the youths to pour the gasoline on herself. She refuses. Angry, the youths attack her until she agrees. The gasoline is poured over her hair and body. Satisfied with the drenched woman, one of the members lights a match and throws it on her. She's immediately engulfed in flames. As the story goes, the youths laugh and run away. Renee tries her best to roll into the ground in hopes of putting out the flames, but to no avail. Pain rips through her body as she screams her way out of the alley towards the nearest open liquor store. Her hair was burnt to her scalp, her face blackened. An attempt to put out the fire is placed by customers and clerks who pat her down with clothes while trying to remove her own. Clerk Fred Courtney, or Prince, stated, quote, "Her clothes were all afire and just falling off her to the ground in bits and pieces. She wasn't hollering or crying. Her hair was on fire and her face was black. It was amazing that she could even talk. Her clothes were smoldering. Her skin was peeling. She walked in and said, 'Will you please call an ambulance?' Then she turned around and walked out, just like nothing happened. God, that poor girl," unquote. A patrol car takes notice of the blaze and escorts Renee to Boston City Hospital. She has second and third degree burns covering 90% of her body. Renee was so charred that, disregarding the bottom of her feet, doctors said, quote, "You couldn't tell whether she was black or white," unquote. At her bedside, police sit with her, a tape recorder at the ready. Within 5 hours, Renee Wagler was dead. The media's take on her murder ran headlines that read, quote, "Woman torched to death," "Human torch murder," and Evelyn Wagler took an emergency walk through a black neighborhood, ... and died, unquote. Commissioner DeGraza said in a news conference that there wasn't any motive for her murder, with Mayor Kevin White quoted in the New York Times saying, quote, "Boston does have isolated examples of racial incidents. Every city does. This city is nowhere near a racial war," unquote. Mayor White offered a $3,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Renee's murder, but no one came forward. Author Russell Francis, who grew up in the area Renee was killed, visited the area saying, quote, "I stopped for a moment opposite the spot where Renee Wagler had been cattle prodded down the alley to her death. The alley was only a few feet wide, fenced in but with a gap large enough to squeeze through. The back area was open to a side street that ran off the avenue beside the dilapidated green corner house. Someone in that house, or the apartment next to it, must have heard her screams, must have looked out a window, must have seen, but no one ever came forward to say so," unquote. The sensationalization of her murder, along with other unrelated crimes, raised the questions of race and murder, and though that seems to be the verdict for Renee's death, there are other theories that begin to change the narrative. Theory 1 is the overall theory that Renee's murder was racially motivated. The block where Renee lived had only recently become predominantly black. For years, starting in 1913, the neighborhood was predominantly Jewish. Majority were, quote, "foreign-born," unquote, but were welcomed by new generations of Jews until the late 1930s, when slowly people began to move out of the community by ways of jobs or children. Nearby was the black community that extended from Dover Street to Northampton Street L stations. But after World War II, the black community began to expand. After the riots following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, violence and chaos spread throughout the connecting streets until the Jewish population were, if any, only a few remaining. In 1960, Dorchester Hill had 1,204 residents, and only 10 were black. By 1970, blacks made up half of the neighborhood. But tensions erupted from blacks expanding into other neighborhoods. The New York Times wrote, quote, "At the heart of the tensions has been the spread of blacks into neighborhoods that have been for years the territory of entrenched white ethnic groups. It is in changing neighborhoods that the clashes between the youths have taken place. Black youths from the Columbia Point Project complain that when they take buses to Andrew Square and Irish Southey on their way to school or downtown, they are frequently assaulted by white youths. Blacks contend that the city's reputation for racial harmony is a myth," unquote. Renee may have been just another piece of an ongoing battle, if that theory is true. The second theory was that her murder was drug-related. The Progressive Labor Party newspaper, Challenge Desafio, says that witnesses claim Renee was seen arguing with the man about, quote, bad drugs, unquote, prior to her death. The New York Times write, quote, in the predominantly black neighborhood, Roxbury, where the burning occurred, people spoke of unemployment, hard drugs, and a lack of police protection and decried the slaying, unquote. The Heights newspaper also mentions the possibility that Renee's murder was drug-related, though it didn't explain why. Drugs during the era ranged from LSD to heroin. John D. Miranda, an addiction professional, said that there were little compassion for addicts, specifically heroin addicts. And President Nixon's war on drugs stance didn't soften matters either. Though Renee's roommate stated, quote, we're all people, all women trying to help each other, helping each other grow. That's what Renee was all about. We all wanted to help poor people, deprived people, unquote. It's possible Renee was speaking about drugs on someone's behalf, warning whoever she was talking to stay away. In any case, I haven't found a concrete link between Renee and a drug addiction, but the theory still stands. The third theory was a lesbian hate crime. According to the Challenge Desafio, Renee lived in a lesbian commune. They quote the Boston Phoenix as saying, quote, under the growing acceptability of homosexuality, the climate, even in staid Boston, has changed sufficiently so that the racially mixed group of women living together on quiet residential Wayne Street had already been accepted by their neighbors in the month they lived there before the murder, unquote. Renee's ex-husband Mark told the New York Times, quote, she wanted to go out on her own, relate to other women, be friends with other women. When I say she loved women, I don't say there was no other love. She loved me too, but she chose to focus on women. She felt she could communicate more honestly with women. She found men much more limiting. Regardless of the image you have of lesbians, you should see this as a continuous struggle to grow, to find meaning and joy, unquote. The Challenge goes on to say that the commune was really a home for sex workers, according to eyewitnesses. Though I haven't found anything to support the claim that Renee was a sex worker, it seems apparent she was gay. In a Boston Spirit magazine article, it states that in the 1950s, 5,000 out homosexuals were forced to resign from their jobs. The 1960s saw gay bars raided by police, lining up club goers searching for ID and calling them, quote, faggots, unquote. Social worker Helene Zimmerman spoke of being gay in the 1960s as a, quote, terrible lifestyle, unquote. She describes going to bars and having to switch to a male partner when the police showed up. Though the gay scene improved into the late 60s, early 70s, it's not out of reason to think that Renee's murder may have been a hate crime of sexuality instead of race, if this theory is true. The fourth theory is that TV made the teenagers kill. A few days prior to the murder, Fuzz, a film starring the late Burt Reynolds, aired. The plot focused on police searching for a Boston fire starter who drenched homeless people with gasoline, then lit a match. Police Commissioner DeGraza said, quote, it's about time that the public demanded an end to violence such as this in our movies and television, unquote. The battle between violence in television versus violence in reality has been ongoing for decades, where one study in the late 1960s found, quote, violence on television encourages violent forms of behavior and fosters morale and social values about violence in daily life which are unacceptable in a civilized society, unquote. Another, in an adolescent and emerging adulthood textbook, stated, quote, these studies merely indicate the unremarkable finding that aggressive adolescents prefer aggressive television programs, unquote. But copycat crimes aren't a new phenomenon. In 2001, 24-year-old Thierry Jaraldin of Belgium dressed in a Scream costume before brutally murdering 15-year-old Alison Camber. In the early 1990s, serial killer Eddie Sita is said to have been inspired by the Zodiac Killer for his brutal attack on 8 people, leaving 3 dead and 5 injured. Perhaps Renee was a victim of a group of adolescents' violent experiment, if this theory is true. The final theory is that it was a police cover-up. The Challenge points out that 1, the police arrived onto the scene faster than usual. 2, they had a tape recorder ready for Renee's testimony, but no one has heard said recording. And 3, that the summary of the crime is told through the police perspective and hearsay. Dr. Joseph Linehan stated that Renee was talking and alert when she first arrived. but soon developed respiratory problems. Quote, "We had to perform a tracheotomy, cutting open the windpipe, and put tubes down her throat and into her lungs to keep her breathing," unquote. At the time of the challenge, the recording may not have been available, but the New York Times obtained a snippet. On the recording, Lieutenant Jerome P. McCollum asked Renee a series of questions from what she did for a living to who committed the act, but Renee can barely say much of anything. She states she's a carpenter, but later says she can't open her eyes, until finally requesting for the questioning to end. It said she gave a brief summary of what happened, but details are vague. The one thing that has been definite is that Renee did not want her killers prosecuted, and that 3 of the 6 threatened her days prior. The challenge further says that no one has claimed whether or not they actually sold Renee gas that night. I haven't found the name of the person who sold her gas. Our reports simply state that she bought it and left. From articles, it doesn't appear to be a cover-up, but again, the theory still stands. Mark states simply that Renee was murdered, quote, "by the system, a system that creates ghettos and racial hatred," unquote. Renee's body was cremated and her ashes sent to Madison, Wisconsin to a family the Waglers knew. A service was held on a farm there where her ashes were scattered on a hilltop. Her friends circled the hill and spoke of Renee lovingly. Her son ending the ceremony with, quote, "I was going to live with my mommy this fall. She was going to take care of me," unquote. No matter which theory seems the most plausible, the fact remains that a young 24-year-old woman who only wanted to make the world a better place was murdered. Her dying wishes were not to prosecute her killers, and in a way, that's what happened. No witnesses ever came forward, and no arrests were ever made in the brutal attack of Evelyn Renee Wagler. I'm Mrs. True Crime, and remember to be kind, be loud, be aware. For more information about Evelyn Renee Wagler, why not check out some of these awesome links? And if you like what you saw and heard today, why not drop a like and a comment? Maybe subscribe while you're here. I make new videos every Wednesday, and you don't want to miss what's in store.